Imagine, if you will, the prevailing image of the Middle Ages. It is a picture painted in muted tones of gray and brown, a world of mud-spattered peasants, stern-faced monks, the looming shadow of plague, and a pervasive sense of pious suffering. It is a narrative of hardship, faith, and survival against bleak odds. But to see only this is to miss a crucial, deeply human layer of the medieval tapestry. Beneath the coarse wool and the solemn chants, behind the castle walls, and within the smoky confines of the wattle and daub hut, there were people, not archetypes, but individuals with aching bones, weary minds, and a very human desire to escape, if only for a few hours, the unrelenting grind of feudal life. They sought relief from physical pain, spiritual transcendence, or simply a reprieve from the melancholic monotony of an existence where the finest entertainment might be watching a traveling preacher or speculating on a neighbor's bout of ergot-induced frenzy. This was a world without modern pharmaceuticals, without coffee to jolt the system awake, without the chemical balms for anxiety or depression. In their place, medieval people turned to the most ancient and prolific apothecary of all, the natural world. Their pursuit of altered states was not a fringe activity, but one woven into the very fabric of their culture, though it was rarely framed as recreation in the modern sense. It was disguised as medicine, sanctified as religious ecstasy, demonized as witchcraft, or stumbled upon by accident with a piece of moldy bread. The medieval relationship with mind-altering substances was a complex, contradictory, and often perilous dance with nature's most potent creations. They did not have shady dealers or velvet rope clubs. They had gardens, forests, and meadows. Their dealer was Mother Nature herself, and she was a capricious and often unforgiving supplier who did not provide dosage instructions. This is the story of that relationship, a journey into the foggy, fragrant, and frequently bizarre world of medieval intoxication. Section 1. The Herbal Arsenal, Nature's Dangerous Bounty. The medieval landscape was not a pristine wilderness, but a living pharmacy, a source of both sustenance and peril. Every hedge, field, and forest glade contained plants that could cure a fever, kill a man, or transport him to realms celestial or infernal. The line between a healing draught and a hallucinogenic potion was vanishingly thin, often determined not by the plant itself, but by the intention of the user, the skill of the preparer, and sheer dumb luck. This herbal knowledge was the domain of a diverse group: learned physicians studying ancient Greek and Arabic texts, monks tending their infirmary gardens with devotional care, midwives possessing generations of oral wisdom, and wandering, cunning folk who blended folk magic with practical botany. For the average person, encountering these powerful substances was a regular part of life, be it through a sleeping potion from the local apothecary, a poultice applied by the village wise woman, or a pint of ale that promised a few hours of blessed oblivion. The medieval herbalist cabinet was stocked with a formidable and terrifying array of psychoactive flora. Among the most notorious was henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, a plant that embodied nature's fickle duality. Its name, derived from the Old English for kill hen, hints at its deadly potential. To the medieval mind, it was a plant of profound ambiguity. In meticulously small, carefully measured doses, it was a potent sedative and analgesic. A tincture of henbane could ease the agony of toothache, soothe the tremors of a fever, or make the brutal ordeal of childbirth marginally less traumatic. It was, in essence, the medieval equivalent of a strong anesthetic and painkiller rolled into one. However, the margin between a medicinal dose and a toxic one was perilously narrow. When consumed in slightly larger quantities, or prepared by an inexperienced hand, henbane ceased to be a medicine and became a gateway to delirium. The plant's active compounds, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, are powerful anticholinergics, which disrupt the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the brain. The physiological and psychological effects were dramatic and deeply unsettling. Users would experience extreme thirst and a characteristically dry mouth. Their vision would blur and distort, and they would often be seized by bouts of uncontrollable agitation and disorientation. They might engage in nonsensical, frantic conversations with inanimate objects, or be gripped by the compulsive need to remove their clothing and run screaming through the woods. It was this very capacity to induce a vivid, often terrifying break from reality that also made henbane a key ingredient in the infamous flying ointments associated with witchcraft. Then there was mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, a root whose very appearance seemed to scream of its otherworldly power. Its forked, gnarled root often bore an uncanny resemblance to a crude human form, a feature that captivated the medieval imagination and imbued the plant with a dense aura of magic and superstition. It was believed to grow beneath the gallows, fertilized by the semen or urine of hanged men, and its potency was thought to be so great that it would emit a deafening, lethal shriek when pulled from the earth. This belief led to one of the most macabre harvesting rituals in history. Prospective harvesters were advised to trace 3 circles around the plant with a sword, tie it to a dog, and then retreat to a safe distance while enticing the dog to pull the root from the ground. The unfortunate animal was believed to absorb the fatal scream, sacrificing itself for the human's gain. A practice that speaks volumes about medieval pragmatism in the face of supernatural danger. Now, once safely harvested, mandrake was revered as a panacea. It was a powerful sedative and anesthetic, used to render patients unconscious before surgeries or amputations. It was considered an aphrodisiac and a treatment for infertility. And, most intriguingly, it was used to induce prophetic and vivid dreams. A small piece of the root taken before sleep was thought to open a conduit to divine knowledge or future events. Yet, like henbane, its dark side was ever present. An incorrect dosage could lead to prolonged unconsciousness from which one might never wake, violent vomiting, or a coma that family members might mistake for death or demonic possession. Completing this potent trilogy was belladonna, or deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna, a plant whose very name, beautiful lady, belied its lethal nature. Its use encapsulates the medieval paradox of beauty and danger. Courtly ladies, in their pursuit of the aesthetic ideals of the time, would carefully drip a diluted extract of belladonna into their eyes. The atropine in the plant causes the pupils to dilate widely, creating a dark, lustrous, and mysterious appearance that was considered highly attractive. The downside, of course, was temporary blindness, extreme sensitivity to light, and potential long-term damage to their eyesight, a stark illustration of the perils of medieval cosmetics. Beyond the court, belladonna was a staple of the healers and the witch's toolkit. Its pain-killing properties were employed for everything from easing childbirth to treating the symptoms of the plague. Its powerful hallucinogenic effects made it a crucial component in ritualistic and shamanistic practices. In the context of the flying ointments, it contributed to the sensation of flight, of leaving one's body behind to travel to distant sabbats or celestial realms. The line between a spiritual quest and a toxic overdose was, once again, a matter of milligrams and faith. These 3 plants, henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, formed the unholy trinity of medieval psychoactive herbs, offering glimpses of heaven and hell, often simultaneously, at the risk of one's life. Section 2. Delivery systems, ointments, potions, and bewitched broomsticks. The raw power of these herbs was only part of the story. How they were administered was a science, or more accurately, an art in itself, reflecting a blend of practical knowledge, folk superstition, and a rudimentary understanding of human biology. Medieval people were inventive, if not always safe, in their methods of delivery, creating a range of concoctions designed to bypass the body's defenses and deliver their potent payload to the brain. Nakis, the most infamous of these delivery systems, were the flying ointments. These thick, greasy salves were a topic of both fear and fascination, detailed in witch trial confessions, often extracted under torture, and whispered about in folklore. They were not simple poultices. They were sophisticated transdermal applications. The primary ingredients were the terpene alkaloid-rich plants, henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and sometimes water hemlock or monkshood. These were finely ground and mixed with a fatty base, such as lard or suet, often from a pig or, in more lurid accounts, a baby. The method of application was the most scandalous and physiologically logical aspect of the process. The ointment was not simply rubbed on the skin, it was applied to areas of the body where the skin is thin and rich, with the blood vessels and mucous membranes, ensuring rapid absorption into the bloodstream. This included the armpits, the inner thighs, and most effectively, the genitals. The common household broom, or a staff anointed with the ointment, became the perfect applicator for these intimate areas. The psychological and pharmacological implications are profound. Within minutes of application, the user would experience the full, disassociating force of the terpene alkaloids. The sensation of smearing one's body with a greasy substance, combined with the powerful chemicals now coursing through their veins, created a powerful hallucination of flight. Users reported soaring through the night sky, traveling vast distances to attend witches' sabbats, feasting with the devil, or dancing under a supernatural moon. Were they actually flying? Of course not, but their experiences were as real to them as any waking reality. The church, interpreting these confessions literally, took them as proof of heretical pacts and demonic congress, leading to countless executions. In reality, these were among the world's first documented psychedelic experiences, induced by a clever, if dangerous, understanding of topical drug administration. Beyond the salves, potions, and tinctures were the more common, though no less risky, method of consumption. Apothecaries and healers would steep these powerful herbs in wine, ale, or vinegar. Spiced wine, a common medieval beverage, could easily be transformed into a powerful narcotic by adding extracts of poppy, opium, or mandrake. This dwell, as it was sometimes called, was used to induce a deep, death-like sleep for surgical procedures. A patient could have a limb amputated while under its influence, a horrifying prospect, but still preferable to being fully conscious. Wandering quacks and charlatans sold elixirs in market squares, promising to cure everything from melancholy to gout. These potions were often complex mixtures of herbs, alcohol, and who knows what else, designed more to impress than to heal. Their efficacy was dubious, but their psychoactive effects were often very real, providing a temporary escape from misery, if not a lasting cure. The outcomes were unpredictable. One might find peaceful sleep, a visionary trance, or a frantic episode of screaming at the moon, convinced of one's own transformation into a beast. The magic and the terror of these medieval edibles lay in their glorious uncertainty. Section 3. The social and spiritual context. Medicine, mysticism, and heresy. To judge medieval substance use by modern standards is to miss its essential context. The concept of getting high for purely recreational purposes was not the dominant framework. Instead, the use of psychoactive substances was enmeshed in a complex web of medicine, spirituality, and social sanction, where intent was everything. From a medical perspective, these plants were not drugs of abuse, but vital tools. Pain was a constant companion in an era of manual labor, primitive dentistry, and rampant disease. A poultice of henbane for a toothache, or a draught of poppy-infused wine for a terminal illness, was not a vice but a mercy. Surgeons relied on these powerful sedatives to perform procedures that would otherwise be unimaginably torturous. Midwives used gentle relaxants to ease labor pains. In this context, intoxication was a welcome side effect of pain management. If the patient happened to have vivid dreams or see strange visions while their body healed, it was a small price to pay for relief from suffering. The spiritual and mystical use of these substances was equally, if not more, significant. In a world saturated with belief in the divine, the demonic, and the supernatural, altered states of consciousness were often sought as a direct line to God. Monks and mystics engaged in prolonged fasting, sleep deprivation, and fervent prayer to induce visions. It is not a great leap to imagine that some might have supplemented these ascetic practices with herbal aids. A carefully measured dose of a visionary plant could help dissolve the ego, quiet the internal chatter, and facilitate a state of ecstatic union with the divine. In these cases, the hallucinations were not seen as chemically induced fantasies, but as divine revelations, signs of grace, and sacred encounters. A monk seeing God in the swirling patterns of the chapel stones after inhaling frankincense smoke for hours was experiencing a genuine spiritual event facilitated by chemistry. This, however, created a profound tension with the established church. The institutional power of the medieval church was based on its role as the sole mediator between humanity and God. Visions and spiritual experiences were acceptable, even encouraged, but only when they occurred within a strictly controlled orthodox framework, through the sacraments, the guidance of a priest, or the sanctioned asceticism of a saint. When a peasant, and especially a woman, could access visionary states in her own home with a paste made from weeds, it threatened this monopoly. The church therefore drew a sharp, if arbitrary, line. Visions that came from God through sanctioned suffering were holy. Visions that came from a plant, particularly one associated with folk magic and applied via a broomstick, were heretical and demonic. The same physiological experience could lead to sainthood or the stake, depending on who was experiencing it and how they had achieved it. This is where the figure of the cunning folk, or the village wise woman, becomes so central. These were the unofficial keepers of herbal knowledge, the ones you consulted when the priest's prayers had failed and the physician's leeches had done nothing. They existed in a gray area, respected and feared in equal measure. They provided essential services, healing the sick, aiding in childbirth, offering love potions, and providing charms for protection. Their recipes often included the very psychoactive plants discussed, used for both healing and for inducing trance states for divination or communication with the spirit world. When things went well, they were valued members of the community. When things went wrong, a patient died, a love spell failed, or a bad trip led to public madness, the accusation of witchcraft was never far away. The knowledge that gave these women power also made them vulnerable. The church and secular authorities viewed them with deep suspicion, seeing their practices not as folk medicine, but as a dangerous form of paganism and a challenge to their authority. The witch was often simply a herbalist who had fallen out of favor or whose potent concoctions had produced an unpredictable and frightening result. Section 4. Accidental intoxication and regional curiosities. Not all medieval trips were deliberate. Some of the most dramatic and widespread episodes of mass intoxication occurred completely by accident, revealing a world where the food supply itself was a potential psychoactive minefield. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, entirely different substance use traditions were flourishing with a sophistication that contrasted sharply with Europe's often haphazard approach. The most significant example of accidental intoxication was ergotism, a horrifying condition caused by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which infects rye and other cereal grains. In damp, cold summers, ergot could thrive, its dark, elongated sclerotia mingling with the healthy rye kernels. To a hungry peasant, a slightly blackened loaf of bread was still food. The consequences of consuming this mad bread were catastrophic. Ergot contains a cocktail of alkaloids, including lysergic acid amide, a chemical cousin of LSD. The resulting illness, known in the Middle Ages as St. Anthony's fire, manifested in two terrifying forms. The convulsive form brought on muscle spasms, seizures, crawling sensations on the skin, formication, and vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Victims might laugh maniacally one moment and be seized by apocalyptic visions the next. The gangrenous form was even more gruesome, as the alkaloids constricted blood flow to the extremities, causing limbs to turn black, shrivel, and eventually fall off. Historians have plausibly linked ergotism to some of the most bizarre events of the period, such as the dancing plagues. In one famous episode in 1518, Strasbourg, a woman began dancing compulsively in the street. Within days, hundreds had joined her, dancing themselves to exhaustion, injury, and even death. While mass hysteria was a factor, The possibility of a shared ergot-contaminated food source, inducing convulsions and manic behavior, provides a compelling physiological explanation for such events. At the time, these outbreaks were interpreted as divine punishment, demonic possession, or collective sin, leading to religious frenzies and pilgrimages. The true culprit was a microscopic fungus on their daily bread. While Europeans were accidentally poisoning themselves with their staple food, other cultures were engaging in deliberate and highly refined practices. In the Islamic world, during its golden age, the use of hashish was widespread and well documented. Derived from the resin of the cannabis plant, hashish was consumed in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. Unlike the toxic and unpredictable European herbs, cannabis was relatively safe, and its use was often integrated into spiritual and social life. Sufi mystics, in particular, used hashish as a sacrament to help dissolve the ego and achieve a state of unity with the divine. It was believed to aid in deep contemplation and to inspire poetic and philosophical insights. It was often consumed orally, mixed with sweets, honey, and spices, making it a palatable and controlled experience. While secular authorities periodically attempted to ban its use, fearing moral decay and laziness, it remained a persistent and culturally embedded practice. The legendary assassins, Hashashin, were even said to use hashish before their missions, a claim that is largely mythical, but which cemented the plant's association with both mystique and danger in the European imagination. Another fascinating regional intoxicant was mad honey, found in the mountainous regions around the Black Sea. Bees that foraged on rhododendron flowers produced a honey laden with grainotoxins. In small doses, this honey provided a mild, intoxicating buzz, accompanied by dizziness and mild hallucinations. In larger doses, it could cause vomiting, paralysis, and even death. The ancient Greeks knew of it, and it was said that armies were sometimes defeated by being lured into consuming tempting stores of this poisoned honey left behind by their enemies. For the locals, it was a known quantity, a risky but valued commodity used in small amounts for its medicinal and mind-altering effects, a testament to the global diversity of psychoactive exploration. Section 5. The ubiquity of alcohol. The people's panacea. If psychoactive herbs were the specialist tools of healers and mystics, and accidental intoxications were the terrifying exceptions, then alcohol was the universal and constant companion of medieval life. It was the true people's intoxicant, consumed by every class from the lowliest serf to the highest monarch, and integrated into the daily rhythm of existence. The primary reason for this was simple. Water was often unsafe to drink. Rivers and wells were frequently contaminated with sewage and other pollutants, making them a source of dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. The process of fermentation, which produced ale and beer, killed many of these pathogens, making the beverages inherently safer. Consequently, everyone, including children, drank alcohol daily. The most common drink was small beer or weak ale. This was a low-alcohol beverage, probably around 1 to 2% ABV, consumed from morning till night. It provided hydration, calories from the grains, and a gentle, sustaining buzz that took the edge off a hard day's labor. It was not consumed to get drunk, but to stay healthy and functional. For those seeking a stronger effect, there were plenty of options. Mead, fermented from honey, was an ancient and potent favorite, particularly in Northern Europe. Wine was the drink of the Mediterranean and the elite. Its importation and consumption were marks of status. In monasteries, the brewing of stronger ales was a sacred and scholarly pursuit, with monks perfecting recipes that provided both sustenance and a means to ease the strictures of monastic life. Taverns and inns served as the social hubs of the medieval world, functioning as combination pub, newsroom, and court of public opinion. Here, alcohol was the great social lubricant, fueling celebrations, sealing business deals, and providing a temporary escape from the rigid hierarchies of feudal society. It was used to dull the pain of medieval dentistry, to treat melancholy, a forerunner of drowning one's sorrows, and to fuel the bawdy songs and storytelling that were a primary form of entertainment. Alcohol's role was so fundamental that it transcended categorization. It was food, medicine, social ritual, and spiritual symbol, as in the Eucharist. While the Church might preach against the sin of drunkenness, it never condemned alcohol itself, as it was too deeply woven into the fabric of daily survival and community. In a world of uncertainty and pain, alcohol was the most reliable and accessible form of comfort and escape. Section 6. A legacy of fog and visions. The medieval mind altered. The medieval experience with intoxication leaves us with a complex legacy. It was a world grappling with the powerful forces of nature, without the tools of modern science to understand them. Their approach was a mixture of bold experimentation, deep-seated superstition, practical necessity, and spiritual yearning. They walked a razor's edge between healing and poisoning, revelation and damnation, community and chaos. Their story challenges our modern assumptions about drug use. For them, these substances were not a rejection of society, but were often deeply embedded within its structures, its medicine, its religion, its social hierarchies. The high was not always the goal. It was a means to an end, the end of pain, the beginning of a conversation with God, or the brief suspension of a brutal reality. The medieval world understood on an intuitive level that consciousness was malleable. They knew that the mind could be open to other realms, whether those realms were defined as celestial, infernal, or simply the bizarre landscape of their own brain under the influence of terpene alkaloids. They lacked our vocabulary of neurotransmitters and receptors, so they explained these experiences through the lenses available to them: divine intervention, demonic temptation, or the inherent virtues of God's created plans. This history also serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers of a world without regulation or precise measurement. The same garden that provided a life-saving anesthetic could also supply a lethal poison. The same loaf of bread that fed a family could trigger a mass hallucination that would be interpreted as a plague sent by an angry God. Their world was, in this sense, far more unpredictable and psychologically volatile than our own. In the end, the people of the Middle Ages were not so different from us. They sought relief, meaning, and escape. Their methods were riskier, their understanding was framed by myth and faith, and their outcomes were wildly unpredictable. But in their willingness to look at a strange root, a fragrant leaf, or a bubbling brew and wonder, what happens if they displayed a fundamentally human curiosity? They ventured into the foggy borderlands of consciousness, armed with little more than folklore and courage, and returned with stories of flying, of saints, of demons, and of turnips that spoke with the voices of their ancestors. It was a dangerous game, but in a world so often defined by hardship, the temptation to peer beyond the veil was simply too great to resist. This intricate dance with psychoactive substances was not confined to the shadowy corners of society or the desperate fringes. It was, perhaps most surprisingly, woven into the very heart of medieval spiritual practice, within the hallowed walls of the church itself. The thick, fragrant clouds of incense that filled cathedrals and chapels were not merely symbolic. They were, in their own right, a mild and sanctioned form of altering consciousness. The most common incenses, frankincense and myrrh, are resins that, when burned, release psychoactive compounds. Modern studies have shown that frankincense smoke contains insensyl acetate, which has been demonstrated to have antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects in mice by modulating the brain's limbic system. For the medieval worshiper, spending hours in a poorly ventilated, smoke-filled chapel during a long mass or vesper service, the effects would have been tangible. The combination of chanting, fasting, dehydration, and the steady inhalation of incense fumes could induce a mild, trance-like state. The boundaries between the self and the divine would soften, the shimmering gold of the altarpiece might seem to pulse with life, and the Latin chants could feel like a direct conduit to heaven. What was interpreted by the clergy and the faithful as a state of religious ecstasy, a lifting of the soul towards God, was likely a gentle psychoactive experience facilitated by chemistry. This was not heresy. It was orthodoxy. The church had unwittingly created the perfect environment for a shared, mild, and theologically acceptable alteration of consciousness, a divine buzz that made the mysteries of faith feel more immediate, and the long hours of prayer more bearable. Thus, the medieval landscape of intoxication was a spectrum ranging from the accidental and terrifying, ergotism, to the deliberate and spiritual, incense, mystical quests, with the mundane comfort of alcohol forming a constant baseline. The perception of these states was entirely dependent on context. A vision experienced in church after inhaling frankincense was a gift from God. The same vision experienced after applying a witch's ointment was a demonic deception. A lethargic stupor from poppy juice was a successful surgery. The same stupor in a healthy young man was sloth. This leads us to the final, overarching question. How did medieval society ultimately reconcile these experiences? The answer is that they never truly did. Their worldview was capacious enough to contain the contradiction. The medieval mind was comfortable with paradox. A plant could be both medicine and poison, a gift from God and a tool of the devil. It all depended on who was using it, for what purpose, and with what outcome. The legacy of this era is not a single discovery or a banned substance, but a profound lesson in the human relationship with consciousness. The drive to alter one's mental state is a near universal human constant. The methods and the meanings we assign to them are shaped by culture, knowledge, and power. The Middle Ages show us a world where this drive was channeled through the only avenues available, the natural pharmacy in the rituals of faith. It was a risky endeavor, a journey undertaken without a map, where the destination could be enlightenment or a grave. In the end, the people of the Middle Ages, in their quest for relief, transcendence, or simple forgetfulness, were navigating the same fundamental human desires that we do today. They lacked our scientific understanding and our regulatory frameworks, so their experiments were more dangerous and their interpretations more fantastical. But in the flickering firelight of a cottage, as a healer prepared a paste of henbane and fat, or in the solemn gloom of a cathedral, as a monk breathed in the sacred smoke, they were all seeking the same thing, a temporary passport out of the constraints of their world. They sought to touch the divine, to silence pain, or to simply laugh in the face of a life that offered few reasons for laughter. Their methods may seem primitive and terrifying to us, but their courage, or their desperation, to explore the frontiers of their own minds remains powerfully, undeniably human. The fog of history may have settled over their specific realities, but the echoes of their journeys, in the warnings of folklore, the records of witch trials, and the pages of ancient herbals, remind us that the desire to get high, in all its complex manifestations, is a thread woven deeply into the very fabric of our past. The pursuit of altered states in the Middle Ages was not merely a matter of folk knowledge and backyard harvesting. It was also a driving force in early economics and international trade. The demand for mind-altering substances created networks of exchange that stretched across continents, influencing geopolitics, enriching merchants, and creating early versions of the black market. While a peasant might make do with local henbane, the elite and the medical establishments of growing cities desired more exotic and refined commodities. Opium, for instance, was not a major feature of early medieval European herbology, but its use grew significantly through trade with the Islamic world. Imported from the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor, opium was a valuable and expensive luxury item. Apothecaries sold it as a potent painkiller and sedative, often in the form of laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, a precursor to the famous Paracelsian remedy of the Renaissance. The trade routes that brought silk and spices from the East also carried parcels of this powerful resin, making it a substance of both commerce and control. Similarly, the incenses so vital to the church, frankincense and myrrh, were sourced from the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Their journey was long and perilous, controlled by a series of middlemen who understood the immense value of these sacred commodities. The kingdoms that controlled the production and trade of these resins, such as the Sabaean kingdom in ancient Yemen, grew immensely powerful on the back of this scented gold. For the church, securing a steady supply was a matter of theological and practical necessity. The very atmosphere of holiness in their cathedrals depended on it. This creation of value also led to early forms of regulation and prohibition, which in turn spawned illicit markets. When authorities, whether royal or ecclesiastical, banned certain substances, it did not eradicate their use. It simply drove them underground. The witches' ointments are a prime example. While a wise woman might openly grow belladonna for healing purposes, the moment she was suspected of using it for flying, she became a criminal. This created a clandestine network for the distribution of these potent herbs. Knowledge was passed on in secret, and preparations were made in hidden places, away from the prying eyes of the priest or the local bailiff. The alewives who brewed beer also operated within a tight economic framework. Brewing was one of the few viable businesses for women in the medieval period. However, as brewing became more commercialized and profitable, it began to be regulated by guilds and municipal authorities, often pushing women out. Laws were passed governing the price, quality, and measures of ale. An alewife who was found to have adulterated her brew with stronger, more dangerous herbs like henbane to increase its potency, a practice that did occur, faced severe punishment. This tension between traditional, often female-dominated domestic production and the rise of a regulated, male-dominated commercial industry is a crucial part of the economic story of medieval intoxication. To understand the medieval trip, one must abandon the modern framework of recreational drug use and enter a worldview where the supernatural was an immediate and tangible reality. The hallucinations induced by plants were not interpreted as chemical reactions in the brain, but as genuine perceptual experiences of the spiritual realm. The content of these visions was profoundly shaped by the cultural and religious setting of the user. A devout Christian mystic, using a substance to deepen their prayer, was predisposed to see visions of the Virgin Mary, angels, and the dazzling light of God. The experience would be framed as a visio intellectualis, an intellectual vision granted by divine grace. The sensory distortions, the swirling colors, the feeling of weightlessness would be interpreted as the soul shedding its earthly bonds. Conversely, for someone operating outside orthodox boundaries, or for a common peasant who consumed ergot-infected bread, the same physiological sensations could be terrifyingly demonic. The disinhibition and loss of control caused by tryptane alkaloids could lead to blasphemous utterances or erratic behavior. The feeling of flight could be interpreted as being carried away by demons. The visual distortions, the melting faces, the monstrous figures, were not abstract patterns, but were populated by the demons, imps, and evil spirits that populated the medieval imagination. Trial records of witches are filled with descriptions of seeing the devil as a black goat or a monstrous man, of feasting on foul food at a sabbat, and of wild orgiastic dancing. These narratives align strikingly with the known effects of the Datura Belladonna Mandragora cocktail: confusion, amnesia, vivid and often terrifying imagery, and a sensation of movement or flight. This raises a profound question. Did the psychoactive plants create the archetype of the witch's Sabbath, or did they simply provide a vehicle for experiencing a pre-existing cultural narrative? The answer is likely a combination of both. The plants provided the chemical key to unlock the doors of perception, but the mind, steeped in sermons about Satan and hell, populated the resulting void with its deepest fears and most transgressive desires. The trip was a Rorschach test for the medieval soul, revealing either its piety or its latent heresy, depending on the set and setting. To place the European experience in context, it is essential to glance beyond the continent's borders, where the use of entheogens and intoxicants was often more systematized and culturally central. In the Americas, civilizations were built around a deep relationship with powerful psychoactive plants. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs used tyranny, flesh of the gods, a name for psilocybin mushrooms, in sacred rituals to commune with deities. The Maya used ritual enemas to administer substances like balshi, a fermented honey drink, and possibly tobacco, allowing for rapid and intense absorption. The use of ololiuqui, morning glory seeds containing LSA, a precursor to LSD, and peyote in North American shamanic practices dates back thousands of years. Here, intoxication was not a fringe activity, but the very core of religious and divinatory practice, a direct dialogue with the gods that structured the cosmos. In Africa, diverse cultures utilized a range of substances. The Bwiti cult in Central Africa used the powerful hallucinogen iboga, tabernanthe iboga, in initiation ceremonies, believing it allowed them to communicate with ancestors in the spirit world. Across the continent, various forms of fermented drinks and hemp were used in social and ritual contexts. In Asia, alongside the Islamic use of hashish, other traditions flourished. In India, the use of soma, a mysterious, deified plant mentioned in the Vedas, is one of the oldest documented entheogens in history, though its exact identity has been lost. Bhang, a cannabis preparation, has been used in Hindu festivals like Holi for centuries, associated with the worship of Lord Shiva. In Siberia, shamans use the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, to induce trance states for journeying to the spirit world. This global perspective reveals that medieval Europe was somewhat of an outlier in its ambivalence and fear of psychoactive plants. While other cultures often integrated them into their spiritual and social fabric, Europe's dominant religious institution viewed them with deep suspicion, associating them with paganism, heresy, and witchcraft. This fundamental difference in attitude would have profound consequences for the future of the substance use in the Western world. The late Middle Ages and the transition into the Renaissance saw the beginnings of a shift away from the purely magical and spiritual understanding of psychoactive plants. The rise of universities, the translation of Arabic medical texts, and a growing emphasis on empirical observation began to change the discourse. Figures like Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, epitomized this transition. He was both an alchemist, steeped in esoteric traditions, and a pioneering physician who championed the use of specific chemical remedies, including laudanum. He famously declared, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Solely the dose determines that a thing is not a poison." This was a revolutionary statement that began to move the conversation away from the nature of the plant, inherently good or evil, and towards the quantity used. The invention of the printing press allowed for the wider dissemination of herbals. While these books still contain fantastical elements, they also represented an attempt to systematically catalog and illustrate plants for identification. This democratization of knowledge began to wrest the control of herbal lore away from the sole domain of the cunning folk and into the hands of a more professional and increasingly male medical class. The witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries marked the violent, final chapter of the medieval relationship with psychoactive plants. The knowledge of the wise women, once a community resource, was now criminalized and demonized. The flying ointments were no longer seen as remnants of pagan shamanism, but as proof of a diabolical conspiracy. The Great Age of the European witch trials was, in part, a war on a certain type of knowledge and a certain method of accessing altered states. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, the medieval world of intoxication had largely faded. Alcohol and tobacco, a New World import, became the dominant recreational drugs. Opium and its derivatives would be taken up by the medical establishment. The old, dangerous, and visionary herbs like henbane, mandrake, and belladonna were relegated to the margins, their power too great and their effects too unpredictable for a new age that prized reason, order, and control. The fog of medieval visions had lifted, leaving behind a world that was perhaps safer and more predictable, but one that had also lost a direct, if perilous, pathway to the strange and numinous realms that had once felt so tantalizingly close. The story of getting high in the Middle Ages is more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting fundamental aspects of the human condition. It speaks to our eternal struggle with pain, our yearning for transcendence, and our innate curiosity about the frontiers of our own consciousness. The medieval person, armed with folklore and a mortar and pestle, was a pioneer in this internal exploration. Their legacy is not found in a specific recipe or a banned substance list, but in the enduring questions they force us to confront. How does culture shape the drug experience? Where do we draw the line between medicine and poison, religion and heresy, healing and witchcraft? In our modern world, with our clinically synthesized pharmaceuticals and our regulated intoxicants, we have created a semblance of control. Yet the fundamental drive remains. The medieval quest for oblivion and ecstasy, for a vacation from the self, echoes in our own continued use of substances, from the morning coffee to the prescription sleeping pill to the weekend cocktail. They remind us that the desire to alter consciousness is a profound and persistent human impulse. Their methods were crude, their understanding was framed by myth, and their journeys were fraught with mortal danger. But in their willingness to chew the strange root, to inhale the sacred smoke, and to smear the greasy ointment, They demonstrated a raw, courageous, and fundamentally human desire to see what lay beyond the veil of everyday reality. They sought in their own way to touch the divine, to silence the scream of existence, and to discover, if only for a few hours, that the world was wider, stranger, and more full of possibilities than it had seemed at dawn. The pursuit of altered states of consciousness, a thread woven deeply into the human experience, found a particularly complex and vivid expression in the period we now call the Middle Ages. To truly grasp the texture of this pursuit, one must move beyond the simple binaries of medicine and poison, piety and heresy, and immerse oneself in the daily realities of a world where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual were porous, and where nature was both a source of sustenance and a repository of terrifying, wondrous power. This was not a monolithic experience. It varied dramatically from the sun-baked monasteries of Italy to the misty, peat-smoked longhouses of Scandinavia, from the bustling, cosmopolitan ports of the Islamic world to the isolated villages of Eastern Europe. The very definition of what constituted an intoxicant was fluid, encompassing everything from a humble loaf of bread to anointing oils prepared under a waning moon. Consider the sensory landscape of a medieval town. The air was thick with smells: wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the pungent aroma of tanneries. In this olfactory cacophony, the scent of brewing ale or baking bread would have been a comforting anchor. But these very comforts could be deceptive. The grain stored in damp granaries could harbor the sinister, dark purple growth of the ergot fungus. When baked into bread, it became a silent mass intoxicant capable of twisting a community into convulsions and visions. The response to such an event was not epidemiological, but theological. An outbreak of ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, was interpreted as a divine punishment or a demonic assault. Pilgrimages were organized, relics were paraded, and prayers were offered to saints known for their intercession against poison and disease. The Order of St. Anthony built hospitals specifically for sufferers, and while their treatment, often involving a switch to wheat-based bread, could alleviate the symptoms, the true cause remained a mystery, shrouded in supernatural explanation. This accidental, communal intoxication reveals a world where the line between a meal and a psychedelic ordeal was non-existent, where the food on one's plate could be a direct conduit to heaven or hell. Beyond these accidental journeys lay the deliberate, carefully managed use of plants. The knowledge required to navigate this herbal arsenal was not found in a single authoritative text, but was distributed across a spectrum of practitioners. At one end were the university-trained physicians, men who studied the works of Galen, Avicenna, and Dioscorides. Their approach was theoretical and humoral, seeking to balance the body's essential fluids. To them, a plant like opium was a powerful cold substance, useful for countering hot, inflammatory conditions. They prescribed it with a learned air, but their understanding was often divorced from the practical realities of harvesting and preparation. At the other end of the spectrum was the village wise woman or the cunning man. Their knowledge was empirical, passed down through generations, learned by watching which plants eased a cow's labor pains or which berries made a child sleep. They were the first responders to most ailments, and their repertoire inevitably included the psychoactive herbs. They knew that a poultice of henbane could draw the pain from a rotten tooth, that a tea of chamomile and poppy could calm a colicky baby, and that a salve containing belladonna, applied sparingly, could relieve the deep ache of rheumatism. It is within this folk tradition that the most enigmatic practices, such as the flying ointments, must be understood. The modern imagination, fueled by centuries of propaganda and sensationalism, pictures witches literally mounting broomsticks and soaring into the night. The pharmacological reality is far more fascinating. The recipes for these ointments, sometimes confessed under torture, describe a blend of fat, often from a goose, a pig, or in more lurid accounts, an unbaptized infant, with the finely crushed leaves and roots of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and sometimes water hemlock or aconite. The application to sensitive, mucous, membrane-rich areas of the body ensured the rapid absorption of the tryptophan alkaloids into the bloodstream. The resulting experience was not one of literal flight, but of a profound dissociative state. The user would feel a sensation of rising, of moving at great speed through the air. The familiar confines of their cottage would dissolve, replaced by visionary landscapes. A wild gathering, the Sabbat, a feast with a horned figure, a frenzied dance. These visions were not random. They were drawn from the deep well of folk belief, Christian demonology, and pre-Christian shamanic remnants that still lingered in the European psyche. The witch, in her trance, was experiencing a powerful, chemically induced narrative that her culture had already prepared for her. For the inquisitors who recorded these confessions, they were proof of a compact with Satan. For the user, it may have been a form of ecstatic liberation, a secret knowledge, or a terrifying ordeal. The interpretation was as variable as the individual. The role of the church in this landscape was profoundly ambivalent. On one hand, it was the ultimate arbiter of spiritual experience. Visions, ecstasies, and trances were acceptable, even laudable, when they occurred within a orthodox framework. To a saint like Hildegard of Bingen in her cloister, or to a mystic like Marjorie Kempe through her tears and prayers. These states were interpreted as gifts of divine grace, evidence of a soul so purified that it could commune directly with God. The tools for achieving these states were fasting, self-flagellation, sleep deprivation, and fervent prayer. Methods that, by stressing the body and mind, could themselves induce altered states of consciousness. On the other hand, when similar states were achieved through a potion or an ointment, they were immediately suspect. This was not grace, it was artifice. It was the work of the devil, who could mimic the effects of divine ecstasy to lead souls astray. The church thus monopolized the means of transcendence, criminalizing the shortcut offered by herbs. The same physiological experience, the feeling of union with a higher power, the visual and auditory hallucinations, could lead to canonization or the stake, depending on its source. This tension created a hidden world of spiritual seeking, where the desire for direct contact with the divine had to be pursued in secret, with tools that the authorities had defined as diabolical. The social setting of intoxication was equally critical. The tavern was the secular heart of a village or town. Here, alcohol was the great social equalizer, a democratizing force in a rigidly hierarchical society. A peasant could share a pint with a craftsman, and for a few hours the burdens of feudal obligation could be forgotten. Ale and beer were nutritional staples, but stronger drinks like mead or wine were reserved for festivals, celebrations, and the tables of the wealthy. Drunkenness was a common vice, frequently denounced in sermons, but just as frequently indulged. It provided a sanctioned release valve for social pressures, a temporary space where the normal rules of conduct were relaxed. In contrast, the use of powerful herbs was often a solitary or small group activity. It was not a social lubricant, but a journey inward, or upward, or downward. It was the domain of the individual seeker, the coven, or the patient and healer in a private consultation. The economic dimensions of this story are often overlooked. The trade in psychoactive substances was a small but significant part of the medieval economy. Opium, a luxury item, had to be imported from the East, making it expensive and confining its use largely to the urban elite and the monastic infirmaries of the very wealthy. The incenses of the church, frankincense and myrrh, were transported along ancient trade routes from Arabia and Africa, their cost reflecting the peril of their journey. This trade was a source of immense wealth for the merchants who controlled it and of spiritual power for the church that consumed it. On a local level, the alewife who brewed a particularly potent batch might gain a valuable reputation, while the cunning woman who sold love potions or healing amulets could earn a meager but independent living. When authorities began to regulate these practices, as with the imposition of beer purity laws like the Reinheitsgebot in Germany, which mandated only water, barley, and hops, it was often an attempt to control quality, but also to suppress the use of other, more dangerous adjuncts like henbane or bog myrtle that had been common in earlier crude oils. The psychological impact of these substances cannot be overstated. Living in a world where nightmares could be physically embodied through a plant, where a simple headache remedy could open a portal to conversing with spirits, must have profoundly shaped the medieval mindset. It was a world where the mind was perceived as vulnerable, permeable to external forces both benevolent and malevolent. The experience of a bad trip on henbane, with its characteristic hallucinations of demons, animals, and dismemberment, would have felt like a very real attack by evil spirits. The feeling of bliss and unity from a more controlled dose of opium or cannabis in a different cultural context could be interpreted as a glimpse of paradise. These were not trips in the modern recreational sense. They were encounters with the fundamental forces that were believed to govern the universe. The user was not a passive consumer, but an active participant in a cosmological drama, one where the stakes were the salvation or damnation of their immortal soul. As the Middle Ages waned, the ground began to shift. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical learning and its new spirit of empirical inquiry, started to change the way people looked at nature. Herbals became more accurate in their illustrations. Figures like Paracelsus began to advocate for a more chemical and experimental approach to medicine, even as he clung to alchemical concepts. The witch hunts, which reached their fever pitch in the early modern period, represented a final violent effort to stamp out the old folk knowledge of plants, a knowledge that was increasingly seen not just as heretical, but as backward and unscientific. The cunning folk were persecuted out of existence, and their knowledge was driven underground, lost, or relegated to superstition. The legacy of medieval intoxication is a complex one. We see its echoes in our continued fascination with witches and their potions, in the enduring power of alcohol as a social institution, and in the modern debate over the use of psychedelics for therapeutic and spiritual purposes. The medieval experience teaches us that the human desire to transcend ordinary consciousness is a powerful and persistent force. It shows us that the way a society channels, controls, and interprets that desire is a reflection of its deepest values, fears, and power structures. The people of the Middle Ages may have lacked our scientific vocabulary, but they possessed an intimate, visceral understanding of the power of plants to reshape reality. They ventured into these inner landscapes with courage and desperation, seeking healing, vision, and escape. And in doing so, they left behind a map of the human soul in all its dark, brilliant, and bewildering complexity. This intricate tapestry of belief, biology, and circumstance extended into every corner of daily life, often in ways that would seem inconceivable today. The very concept of self-medication takes on a new meaning in an era where a headache might be treated with a prayer, a poultice, and a pint of strong ale, all simultaneously. There was no clear division between the physiological and the spiritual causes of illness. A lingering melancholy might be diagnosed as an imbalance of the black bile, but it could just as easily be attributed to the malign influence of a witch's curse or the sorrow of a soul feeling distant from God. The treatment, therefore, had to address all these levels. A physician might prescribe a diet to rebalance the humors. A cunning woman might provide a protective amulet or a tea of St. John's wort, a known mild antidepressant, and the priest would prescribe prayer, confession, and perhaps a pilgrimage. The psychoactive properties of any herbs involved were simply part of a holistic approach to restoring harmony to the body and soul. This holistic view extended to the animal kingdom as well. Veterinary medicine relied on the same herbal knowledge. A prized warhorse suffering from colic might be treated with a drench containing sedative herbs, and livestock were often fed or anointed with plants believed to ward off evil spirits that cause disease. The boundaries between human and animal medicine were fluid, and the same plants that could send a human on a visionary journey could be used to calm a frightened beast or stimulate a lethargic one. This shared pharmacopoeia underscores the medieval view of a unified creation, where humans, animals, and plants were all part of an interconnected web of life, all subject to the same natural and supernatural forces. The transmission of this knowledge was itself a fragile and fascinating process. In the monasteries, it was preserved in beautifully illuminated manuscripts, copied by hand by scribes who might not fully understand the practical applications of the recipes they were preserving. In the oral tradition of the countryside, it was passed from mother to daughter, from shepherd to apprentice, through rhyme, story, and demonstration. A rhyme might encode the identifying features of a plant, its uses and its dangers, all in a few easily remembered lines. This was a knowledge held in the body and the memory, a living library that could be extinguished with the death of its keeper, or, more systematically, by the accusations of an inquisitor. The experience of time itself was different under the influence of these substances. In a world without clocks, where life was governed by the rhythms of the sun and the seasons, the temporal distortion caused by plants like mandrake or henbane would have been particularly disorienting and profound. A journey to a witch's sabbat that felt like it lasted all night might, in earthly time, have been over in an hour. This malleability of time further reinforced the sense that these experiences were happening in a different realm, a parallel world operating on its own spiritual clock. For the mystic in prayer, hours could feel like moments in the presence of God. For the victim of ergotism, a moment of terror could feel like an eternity in hell. The role of dreams was also intimately connected to this world of herbal influence. Dreams were not considered mere neural static. They were messages. They could be sent by God, by angels, by demons, or by the dead. They were a source of prophecy, diagnosis, and divine instruction. It is no surprise, then, that plants known to produce vivid and symbolic dreams were highly valued. Mandrake was the most famous of these, but other, less dangerous plants like mugwort were also used in dream pillows to encourage prophetic visions. The line between a drug-induced dream and a divine vision was, like everything else, blurry. If a person dreamed of a future event after taking a mandrake draft, was it the plant or God that had provided the insight? The medieval mind was comfortable with this ambiguity, able to hold both the material cause and the spiritual meaning in tension. Furthermore, the use of these substances was not static. It evolved with contact with other cultures. The Crusades, for all their violence, opened up new channels of exchange between East and West. European knights and travelers encountered the sophisticated medical and botanical traditions of the Islamic world, where the use of cannabis, hashish, and opium was more systematized and in some contexts socially accepted. They brought back not only spices and silks, but also new ideas about medicine and new substances. The works of Arab physicians like Avicenna became standard texts in European universities, introducing more refined concepts of pharmacy and dosage. This cross-pollination slowly began to change European practices, adding new tools to the herbal arsenal and new perspectives on their use. However, this exchange was not without its prejudices. Substances associated with the infidel Muslim world, like hashish, were often viewed with deep suspicion and moral condemnation by Christian writers. They were linked to stories of the Assassins, a Nizari Ismaili sect, who were falsely reputed to use hashish to brainwash their followers into committing political murders. This created a powerful and enduring Islamophobic trope that associated cannabis with fanaticism and violence, further complicating the European relationship with the plant. In the far north, the Viking and broader Germanic traditions had their own unique relationship with altered states. The ceremonial drinking of mead was central to social and political life, sealing oaths and fostering the bonds of the warrior band. But there is also evidence of the use of psychoactive plants in shamanic practices. Fly agaric mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, grow in northern climates, and while the historical evidence for their widespread use by Vikings is scant, their presence in the folklore of Siberia and their dramatic effects, including size distortion and the sensation of flight, suggest they may have been known and used by some Norse shamans or seers. The Icelandic sagas also tell of berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like fury. While this state was likely achieved through a combination of psychological conditioning and ritual, some theories suggest the use of stimulant or hallucinogenic plants to trigger these frenzies. The material culture of medieval intoxication is also worthy of exploration. The tools used tell a story of their own. The apothecary's shop would have been filled with beautiful and functional objects, delicate scales for weighing minute amounts of potent herbs, ceramic and glass jars for storing tinctures and powders, mortars and pestles of varying sizes for grinding roots and seeds. The home of a cunning woman might have a more humble collection, a blackened cauldron, a few wooden bowls, and a collection of pouches and bottles. The tavern required a different set of objects: wooden tankards, leather jugs, barrels, and kegs. Each of these objects was a node in a network of production, distribution, and consumption. A silver-tipped spoon used to measure opium in a wealthy merchant's house, and a wooden bowl used to mix a flying ointment in a peasant's cottage were both instruments for navigating the same fundamental human desires. In the end, the story of getting high in the Middle Ages is a story about knowledge. Who held it, how it was used, and who had the power to define it as wisdom or witchcraft. It is a story about the human body as a battlefield where natural forces and spiritual forces met. It is a story about pain and the desperate creative lengths people will go to alleviate it. And it is a story about the imagination, about the need to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be, more vivid, more meaningful, more connected to the divine, or simply less painful for a few precious hours. The people of the Middle Ages did not have our modern understanding of neurochemistry, but they possessed a deep, hard-won, and often dangerous intimacy with the chemical keys that could unlock the doors of perception. They ventured into these inner worlds with a map drawn from faith, folklore, and bitter experience, and the accounts they left behind, whether in medical texts, trial records, or folktales, are a testament to the enduring and universal human quest to transcend the limits of the mundane self. The intricate relationship between medieval society and psychoactive substances extended far beyond the realms of medicine and recreation, seeping into the very foundations of law, art, and the perception of reality itself. To fully appreciate the scope of this relationship, one must consider the legal and moral frameworks that sought to control these potent forces. Secular law codes, often operating in tandem with ecclesiastical courts, frequently contain statutes against poisoning, which could be broadly interpreted to include the malicious or irresponsible use of herbs. A disagreement between neighbors could easily escalate into an accusation of herbal malice if one party fell ill after sharing a meal. The line between a healing draught and a poisonous potion was often a matter of testimony and reputation rather than forensic evidence. A wise woman with a sharp tongue and knowledge of plants was vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft if her treatments failed or if she fell out of favor with powerful local figures. The laws themselves were thus not just regulatory but social weapons, reflecting a deep-seated anxiety about the hidden powers that could be wielded by those on the margins of society. This anxiety is vividly captured in the art and literature of the period. The gargoyles leering from cathedral eaves, the grotesque demons tormenting souls in illuminated manuscripts, and the vivid descriptions of hell in sermons and mystery plays all resonate with the kind of terrifying imagery reported in bad trips induced by plants like henbane. It is a compelling, albeit speculative, thought that the artists and writers who created these visions may have been drawing, directly or indirectly, on cultural memories of such psychedelic experiences. The sensation of one's body distorting, of being assailed by monstrous beings, of flying uncontrollably through chaotic realms. These are not just theological concepts, but are also classic effects of anticholinergic poisoning. The medieval hell was not an abstract place. It was a psychologically plausible state of torment, and its depiction may have been informed by the very real, shared cultural experience of toxic delirium. Conversely, the radiant gold-leaf visions of heaven, with their geometric patterns and overwhelming light, could find echoes in the more euphoric and mystical states induced by other substances or by extreme ascetic practices. Art, in this sense, can be seen as a visualization of the collective medieval psyche's journey through states of consciousness, both divine and demonic. The experience of childhood and adolescence in such an environment would have been fundamentally different. While children certainly consumed the ubiquitous small beer, their exposure to stronger psychoactives was likely more controlled, though not unknown. Folk remedies for restless children sometimes included mild sedative herbs like poppy or lettuce sap. More poignantly, the rituals of passage from childhood to adulthood sometimes involve symbolic or actual alterations of consciousness. The initiation into certain crafts or guilds, though not documented to involve drugs, often involve rituals, feasts, and ordeals that could include sleep deprivation and alcohol, creating a shared, memorable experience that bonded the initiate to the group. For young men and women in rural communities, love magic and potions were a common, if risky, pursuit. Recipes for philters designed to inspire passion often included herbs like mandrake as an aphrodisiac, but also required elaborate rituals and incantations, blending the psychological power of suggestion with any potential pharmacological effect. The desperation and hope invested in these potions speak to a world where the forces of attraction were not yet fully secularized, but were still influenced by planets, humors, and magical herbs. The very language of the time reveals how deeply these plants were embedded in the cultural consciousness. The word weird, from which we get weird, originally referred to fate or destiny in Old English, but it also carried connotations of the magical and the prophetic, realms often accessed through trance states. To be dream-ridden was to be oppressed by nightmares, often attributed to supernatural beings like elves or demons, but which we might now interpret through the lens of sleep paralysis or toxic dreams. The names of the plants themselves are a lexicon of fear and power. Belladonna, beautiful lady, points to its cosmetic use, while its alternative name, deadly nightshade, tells the other side of the story. Henbane explicitly warns of its toxicity to animals. Mandrake is shrouded in a mythology so potent it required elaborate precautions for its harvest. To speak these names was to invoke their power and their peril. The Black Death of the 14th century represents a cataclysmic moment that profoundly affected all aspects of medieval life, including the use of intoxicants. In the face of a mortality event on such an unimaginable scale, the responses were extreme. Some turned to religious fervor, like the flagellants who sought redemption through self-punishment. Others, confronting the futility of it all, turned to hedonistic despair, captured in the theme of the danse macabre and the sentiment of carpe diem. The consumption of alcohol and the use of pain-numbing herbs like opium likely surged. Apothecaries and physicians were powerless against the plague, and their desperate attempts to treat it or protect it against it involved ever more complex and aromatic recipes, some of which may have included psychoactive ingredients intended to ward off miasmas or strengthen the spirit. The trauma of the plague deepened the medieval fascination with death and the afterlife, themes that are intimately connected to the visionary experiences offered by plants. The desire to peer beyond the veil of death to communicate with the legions of lost souls would have given a new, grim urgency to the practices of seers and cunning folk who used trance-inducing techniques. Moving beyond the herbal and the fungal, one must also consider the role of dissociative states achieved through non-chemical means. The medieval world had a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate consciousness through the body and the environment. Rhythmic drumming, chanting, and dancing were used in folk traditions, and possibly in remnants of pre-Christian rituals. To achieve trance states, the repetitive nature of monastic prayer, the chanting of the hours, the visual fixation on a crucifix or an icon in a dimly lit church, these were all technologies of transcendence, designed to quiet the discursive mind and open the soul to divine influence. Extreme physical austerities, such as those practiced by anchorites and other ascetics, could also produce profound alterations in perception. Prolonged fasting induces ketosis, which can cause euphoria and hallucinations. Sleep deprivation and self-flagellation release endorphins and alter brain chemistry. In a sense, the saints were the most extreme psychonauts of the Middle Ages, using the most brutal methods available to break the bonds of ordinary consciousness and achieve union with a god. Their reported visions, stigmata, and levitations were the celebrated counterparts to the witches' demonic sabbats, two sides of the same coin of human potential for non-ordinary states. The legacy of these practices did not vanish with the end of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance and the scientific revolution sought to demystify the natural world, but the old knowledge persisted in altered forms. Alchemy, the precursor to chemistry, was deeply interested in extracting the quintessence or active spirit from plants and minerals. The search for the panacea, a universal remedy, and the elixir of life drove alchemical research, and many of their experiments involved distillation and concentration of plant materials, creating even more potent tinctures. Paracelsus, a figure straddling the medieval and modern worlds, famously used laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, and championed the concept of dose-dependent toxicity. This was a crucial step towards a modern pharmacological principle, but it was still couched in a worldview where the arcana, or hidden virtues of a substance, were as important as its chemical composition. The Great Age of Exploration also introduced Europe to a whole new world of intoxicants. Tobacco, chocolate, and coffee arrived from the Americas and the Middle East, creating new social rituals and new forms of stimulation and relaxation. These were initially viewed with the same suspicion as earlier foreign substances. Coffee was called the wine of Islam and was opposed by some Christian clergy, but their non-psychotic, stimulant nature, combined with their potential for taxation and social control, led to their eventual acceptance and integration. They provided a new, more manageable form of altered consciousness that was conducive to the emerging capitalist and Enlightenment ethos, focusing the mind for business and intellectual debate rather than shattering it for visionary purposes. The witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries can be seen as the final, violent chapter in the war against the medieval psychoactive complex. The knowledge of the cunning folk, particularly of women, was systematically criminalized and exterminated. What was once a respected, if feared, body of practical knowledge was reclassified as diabolical witchcraft. The flying ointment was no longer a shamanic technology, but proof of a pact with Satan. This persecution was not just about religion, it was about the centralization of power. The state and the church were consolidating their authority over every aspect of life, from law and medicine to the very definition of reality. The autonomous individual access to the divine or the visionary that these plants represented was a threat to that monopoly. By destroying the practitioners, they sought to destroy the pathway. Yet, echoes remained. In remote villages, the old knowledge was preserved in fragments. Fairy tales are littered with references to poisoned apples, sleeping potions, and transformative spells, folk memories of a time when plants held such power. The figure of the witch in the popular imagination retained her association with cauldrons and strange brews, and the substances themselves never truly disappeared. Opium became the foundation of a vast and exploitative global trade. Alcohol remained the unchallenged king of social intoxicants. The potent visionary herbs, however, retreated to the deepest shadows, their power too great and their effects too unpredictable for the new age of reason and order. In the modern world, as we witness a resurgence of scientific and therapeutic interest in psychedelics like psilocybin and MDMA, we are in a way reopening a dialogue with the medieval world. We are relearning what they knew intuitively, that these substances can be portals to profound healing and spiritual insight, but also to terror and psychosis. We are grappling with the same essential questions they did. How do we integrate these powerful experiences into a coherent worldview? Who should have access to them, and who should guide their use? The medieval answer was to outsource these questions to the church, which often responded with fear and suppression. Our modern challenge is to find a new answer, one that combines scientific understanding with respect for the power of these experiences, creating a framework that is both safe and sacred. The long, dark, and fascinating history of getting high in the Middle Ages is not merely a relic of a superstitious past. It is a profound and ongoing chapter in the human story, a testament to our eternal yearning to see what lies beyond the horizon of our own minds.